By the end of the 80s, I was disillusioned by the ANC. And I realized that I didn't think that they could be the vehicle to bring democracy to South Africa. So he said Biko died of brain damage. There was blood cells in his spinal fluid. And that only happens when you've got brain damage.
And what do you make of MK parties bursting onto the scene?
Well, I heard about it before, actually. Last August, I got tipped off that he was going to start a party. And the big fight now between Paul Mashatile and Cyril Ramaphosa in the middle of the presidency around many issues in the GNU shows how those two poles are pulling in opposite directions.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and today I'm extremely excited to be joined by the DA's chairperson of the Federal Council, Helen Zille, for her second time on SMWX. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
It's such a pleasure, and if you're spreading the fire, you must say it with some fire. Spread the fire.
Indeed. Before the July unrest, this was always our tagline, and then we suddenly realized, we just need to make sure this is figurative.
Be very careful that you don't accused of actually spreading fire, literally.
Thank you so much for joining us again. You know, you've been in the public eye for such a long time. Is there anything that people don't know about you that you would like them to know about you?
Well, they know a lot about me that isn't true. The first thing that you have to learn when you're a politician is that the media publishes what your enemies say about you. And then the readers or the consumers of that media believe what they say about you. And the thing that happens most often to me is people get to know me and they say, you're actually not so bad. You're actually quite nice sometimes, even people say. And I say, well, you know, I'm just me. And they say, it's certainly not what we've read about you or seen about you. So I said, John, it comes with the territory. It comes with being a politician. You know that you're going to have lots of enemies, and the more successful you are, the more enemies you're going to have, the more they're going to try and break you down and destroy you, and the more the media is going to publish what they say, and the more people are going to consume that as the truth, and it isn't. So most of what people know about me isn't me.
What do you think is the biggest misconception?
I think, well, obviously, the playing of the race card is an absolute evil in our society. When people have completely run out of arguments, they will call you a racist. And then it's the cheapest and easiest newspaper report or media report to say, X accused someone else of being a racist, right? Now, that's the easiest thing to do because you don't have to get into the substance of the debate. You don't have to get into the complex issues. You just say so-and-so is a racist. And that then becomes the generally accepted fact. Now, that is the most fundamental mistake about me. I mean, anybody who really knows my history, anybody who knows what I've done and how I've been engaged in various things since my earliest days would know that that is nonsense. But that started with the fight that I had against the voluntary severance and redeployment scheme in education in the mid-1990s. I won't bore you with that. It's complex and detailed. But the entire point about it was to protect disadvantaged schools from being stripped of their best teachers. And of course, COSATU and SADTU wanted the right to choose teachers in different posts, and they wanted the power. And so all they had to do was to call me a racist to undermine the legitimacy of my argument. And that has become a cheap and repetitive refrain. And eventually, as Goebbels said, if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. So that is part of the lies that get spread about me. And the truth is something that 90% of people who know me realize is something quite different.
It's an interesting time in media and social media because it seems like these myths that develop around you take on a life of their own.
Yes.
You actually can't control them.
Well, you see, social media has brought a whole new dimension. I mean, Yuval Noah Harari, in his book Sapiens, basically argues that skinnering, gossiping, is part of what makes us human. And that human beings really are ideally suited for groups of about 150 where the intelligence gets shared by gossip. And that is how human beings evolve. That's one of his theses in his book. Now, this I find very fascinating because if it is an inherent human tendency to gossip and to pass news through gossip, then social media has put that on steroids, has absolutely given it a turbocharge. And of course, now the gossip passes across the whole world, and the lies get passed across the whole world before the truth even emerges. And Churchill recognized that. He said, you know, in this world, a lie gets halfway around the world even before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. And that's absolutely true. But he had never envisaged just how much the lie would triumph with social media. That's put that whole syndrome on steroids. And it's something that we politicians have to learn to live with. And you've got to just be able to take it. That's why it all washes off me like water off a duck's back. You know, you can't take it seriously. If you do, you'll start having a warped perception of yourself. You've got to know who you are. And you've got to know that you're standing up for what you genuinely believe is right. And you've got to know that you are open to alternative arguments that may be better, and broad-minded enough to say, I accept your argument. You've come with evidence. You've got a better case. You're right. Obviously, you always have to be open to saying that. But when you have gathered the evidence and looked at it and come to a conclusion, you're going to stand up for it. People are going to call you all kinds of names. The debate is going to be entirely deflected. Social media is going to put the deflected debate on steroids, and you've still got to remain standing when the wave passes.
Seems to be something that you are quite good at in terms of knowing where you're going and not letting the noise conflate with the signal. And that's quite an important trait to have in a politician, because otherwise you get blown with the wind.
Well, Nate Silver wrote a book. He's a great pollster in America. He wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise. And it's a very useful book for a politician to read. I've read it. Some parts of it get very technical and use a lot of jargon and statistical analysis, which is also interesting as a politician. But the bottom line is, he says, you have to learn to distinguish between the signal that you need to pick up and the noise, which is just the dogs barking. And one of the key things you have to do in politics is to be able to spot the trends, note the important signals, dismiss the noise, and move on.
A lot is known about you, as I say, in your public life, particularly since you became mayor in 2006. You have written about your early life, but talk us through some of your earliest memories and some of your more formative memories. I was reading in your memoir, Not Without a Fight, about your grandmother and her siblings, which struck me as quite an important story. Talk us through some of your earliest and most formative memories.
Well, my parents were refugees from Germany, and my mother's family was lucky to have survived, even though their house was destroyed on Kristallnacht and her father taken into custody. But her family did survive and was lucky enough to be able to get out all over the world. So I've got literally cousins all over the world. It is the original diaspora.
Wow.
And my father's family was not so lucky. Most of my grandmother's siblings were murdered in the concentration camps, and some even as early as Kristallnacht. And so I've done a lot of research now, even since I wrote the book, into what happened to them. And one of my great cousins was taken in and used as an experiment for Mengele and injected with smallpox, that kind of thing, you know. So that was my father's family. My father's family really went through a terrible, terrible time in the concentration camps, and very few of them survived. So the interesting thing is that I didn't know that.
Wow.
I didn't know that till after my dad had passed on.
Wow.
He never told us. I don't know why he never told us. I think he never told us because he always used to say, you aren't a victim, you have opportunities, get on with your opportunities. And he was a very forward-looking person. He'd take the history, he'd internalize it, and he would move on. And that is a gift that he gave to us. And I only learned that afterwards when I was actually researching my past a bit so that I could write a bit about it in my book.
Yeah.
So when my dad passed away at 96, I read a lot of his papers. And I saw what an enormous effort he'd put into trying to track down where his cousins were. and where his family was. And he tracked down that some of them had died, but he couldn't track down all of them. And so I decided to follow that up. And I was lucky enough to get to Yad Vashem and to be able to learn a lot about the family members of my father who had been murdered.
Must have had quite a profound impact when you subsequently learned it.
You know, the impact it had on me was to look back in absolute admiration at my parents. They had come through hell, and they were unbelievably grateful to have their lives, and they were absolutely devoted to South Africa, because South Africa had given them a chance to have a life. And they were appalled by the discrimination they saw around them in South Africa. And instead of backing off and saying, well, we're fine, we don't have to worry about other people, they did worry about other people. My mother joined the Black Sash very early on. My dad was a member of the Torch Commando. They were all very committed to equal rights in South Africa because they'd been through what they'd been through in Germany. And so, you know, I was so impressed that my father never once said, oh, terrible things have happened to me and we were such victims. Nothing of that. It's we have an opportunity here, we make the most of it, we work to make South Africa a just country and get on with it. And I was really grateful for that attitude.
Was there a moment in your life where your political consciousness sparked in particular?
Yes, I had many moments like that. You know, when we were growing up, we grew up certainly not in the middle class. My parents were reconstructing their lives. And, you know, when you look at the pictures of my earlier house, you can see in the book that they're corrugated iron walls. You know, I mean, that's how our house was built, out of corrugated iron. And that was very common in those days because, you know, people were coming out of the Depression, the poor white era, you know. It was absolutely common. We were not wealthy people.
Yeah.
And I remember when I had to go to school, first I went to the local Platteland school, and my mother said that some of the kids wouldn't be able to go to school with me, and these were black kids that we played with, and, you know. And that puzzled me first. And then you get over it. You don't ask lots of questions as a kid. But what I remember incredibly clearly when I was in primary school, young, they used to feed us because it was still the end of the poor white era, and we had many people who were really, I mean, they did not have shoes. I went to school and I had shoes. And there were many kids that didn't have shoes, and that was the real distinction. You either had shoes or you didn't have shoes, and it's because your parents couldn't afford shoes. That's why you came without shoes. And there was a feeding scheme once a week to give us protein. And they gave us a piece of cheese and a glass of milk. And at that point, they stopped the feeding scheme for black children. And I remember my mother being so outraged about it. And I came home and she said, you know, you get your meals here and they're taking away the cheese and the milk from poor children to give it to children who are not so poor. And she was so outraged about that. And that was the first thing I saw. And it hit my consciousness very, very hard. And I could never sit there and eat the cheese, a little block of cheese, and drink the milk without feeling I'm taking this away from someone else. And of course the teacher would make you drink it because it was part of the feeding scheme at school, and she'd sit there and wait for you to do it.
Yeah.
But I could never ever do it with a clean conscience because my mother had explained to me how wrong it was.
You then, I'm interested in your UCT era, and when you were a student there in particular. You were at Fuller, I believe.
Yes, I was at Fuller Hall, yes.
Very, very good. And talk us through the UCT years and just before you went into journalism, what was happening in your life at that period?
Well, my UCT years were probably the most difficult of my life, I would say, but very, very important because they made me unbelievably strong. When I got to UCT, I was living in an era pre-feminism, really, where your value as a girl was whether you could find a man at university and go off into the sunset, and that you were there to get sort of a minor degree, but not become a blue stocking, as the saying was in those days. A blue stocking was someone who kept on studying, and no one wanted a blue stocking.
Oh, wow.
So that was basically the general ethos when I went to university back in the day, in the 1960s. And one of the first things we did at Fuller Hall was we had what was known as ontgroening, but it wasn't called that, it was called initiation. All the reses had initiation. It's now not allowed, but we had it then. And we were freshettes, as the term had it. And one of the parts of it was that you had to go to something called the cattle parade, at which the boys from Smuts Hall would come over and bid for you.
Oh my.
So each girl would have to walk along a little ramp in a short skirt, and the boys would bid for you. Now, I've never been through a more humiliating experience in my life. Because some girls are blessed with fabulous legs, and some girls are blessed with not so fabulous legs. And I don't have to tell you that I'm not Princess Catherine when it comes to legs. And very few girls are. And for most of us, it was a very humiliating experience.
Can imagine.
And I got out of there and I thought to myself, I am now going to get thin. And then I, being me and having made up my mind, I stopped eating. And I got thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner to the point that I nearly died. And it was obviously very difficult to study in those circumstances and all of that. So that no one knew about anorexia at the time. No one knew about it. And when I went home for the holidays at the end of my first year, my parents nearly had a heart attack when they saw me. And I went back, but when I came, they made me come back in the July vac of the next year. And then they said, no, Waze, you're not going back. You're not going back, you are going to die. And I was going to die. I mean, I weighed something like 83 pounds, and, you know.
Wow.
So then they sent me to Wits. And
I see. Okay, so that's when you went to Wits.
That's when I went to Wits, and I finished my degree at Wits. And I got well again, and I was very involved in student organizations at Wits. But it was a very important period of coming to terms with who I was, learning not to try and be something that I wasn't, being honest about what was important to me, accepting myself for who I was, but understanding that my life would only have purpose if I could serve others. And then I got very interested in politics, I suppose sparked by my parents' interest. And I was a great reader of media, especially sparked by my father, who'd actually planted that seed in me at school. We had a long ride to school every morning, and he used to buy the Rand Daily Mail and made me read it to him in the car on the way there.
So you would read the paper to him?
Yeah, while he was driving. He'd be driving, and he'd say to me, okay, what's happening in the world? He'd always say.
Yeah.
And then I would say, well, there's this, and there's that, and then the gold standard, and this and that. I remember, you know, and I'd read it, and I'd say, this is what's happening. And then he'd say, do you understand the implications? And I would say no, and would explain them to me. And we'd have these fantastic conversations going to school about the news.
That's very cool.
And that's when I got absolutely passionate about news and about developments. And I'd get very excited, like watching a soapie. I'd be interested to get the paper the next day to see what had happened next in a running story.
Yeah.
And then he'd make me read some of the commentators. And then we discussed whether we agreed or we didn't agree. And that's how I really got a passion about journalism and news. And I was always very good at current affairs at school, you can imagine, because in the current affairs, then they'd say, well, what's happening in news? And I'd be able to say, and I'd be able to explain how South Africa went onto the sliding scale and off the gold standard, and 90% of the teachers didn't understand it, you know. So that was a great thing for me. And then I could just follow my passion. I did do half a teaching diploma with my final year at Wits, but I knew I didn't want to go into teaching. So then I went into journalism.
Thanks for sharing that, because we think of you as the unfazed Helen Zille, the unflappable Helen Zille, the resolute Helen Zille.
But that's how you become resolute. Only by going through terrible experiences in life. You learn to accept yourself only when you've been through a period of not accepting yourself. You get experience to make good judgments in complex situations only because you've once made bad judgments in complex situations. That's called growing up. And experience is there for a reason.
Yeah. The stories about I must ask my son to read the newspaper to me in the car
you must.
when he gets
Older,
there.
Yeah. I mean, at 2.5, it's a little bit early.
That's a bit. But the Biko story, when you went to the Rand Daily Mail, of course, has become something of legend. Can you help us understand a bit more the role you played in uncovering what had happened with Biko's death and separate fact from fiction in terms of that story and how you fit into it?
Well, you will remember that on the 12th of September, 1977, Jimmy Kruger, who was then the Minister of Justice, announced that Steve Biko had died after going on a hunger strike. And his strong implication was that he had starved himself to death. Now, if anybody knew that you don't starve yourself to death overnight or over a week after you were detained, it was me, And Biko was a big man. He wasn't, he wasn't small and
I didn't realize that.
Fragile. He was a big man. And, I knew immediately it was a lie, and everybody knew it was a lie. You don't go in and stop eating on the Monday, and the next Monday you're dead. It doesn't work that way. So we had to get to the truth. And Jimmy Kruger was saying things that leaves me cold, he's not interested, and move on. Now, Steve Biko was a very big name, and he was a big name when I was at university as well, because he broke with NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students that I was involved with. Right. He broke with that, and he said, "Black man, you're on your own," basically. And it was a huge initiator of much debate amongst the non-racial student movement. So he became a big figure, and then he was murdered. And we knew he was murdered, and I had a very good editor, Alistair Sparks, who said to me, "We have to get to the bottom of this." And I said, "Yes, we do. It's going to be difficult." Now, what happened then was that we made contact with a doctor who was the private pathologist of the Biko family. And he was prepared to talk to us. But he said, "If you reveal your sources, I am done for." So he said Biko died of brain damage. There was blood cells in his spinal fluid, and that only happens when you've got brain damage. And he said the lumbar puncture and the autopsy showed that he died of brain damage. But we couldn't publish any of the medical papers, and we couldn't reveal our sources. His name was Dr. Gluckman. And we promised him that we wouldn't reveal the source, but I can speak about it now because he's passed on.
I see.
He passed on long ago. And he was really a hero, but at the time he was very frightened about what would happen. So Alistair said, well, we've got to be able to use this information without compromising him. So he sent me off to speak to the doctors who had seen Steve Biko in Port Elizabeth. And they were a Dr. Lang, a Dr. Tucker, and a Dr. Hirsch. And Dr. Lang and Dr. Tucker were district surgeons. And they were very hostile to me. They'd obviously seen Steve Biko after he'd been assaulted and when he was unconscious, and they didn't know whether he was shamming or not. That became a big part of the debate. And they wouldn't speak to me. They kicked me out, and Lang was the worst. He said he'd put his dogs onto me, but Tucker was almost as bad. And then I went to see Dr. Hirsch. And Dr. Hirsch was different. He invited me in. He said, "Sit down." He said, "Look, I can't talk about it because I acted on behalf of the state, and I was the specialist neurologist that was brought in, but things are not what they seem, and terrible things happened." That's all he would say to me. And then he said to me, "But I can tell you this, there was no sign of a hunger strike." That's what he said to me. So I went back to Alistair and I said, what we've got is that we can say definitively that he didn't die of a hunger strike. That we can say definitively.
Yeah.
And we can say definitively that the truth has not been told. And then we published it in a story that said no sign of hunger strike Biko doctors. But then they demanded to know which doctors had said that, and they took me to the press council, and there was a judge there who said, when I refused to reveal my sources, obviously, the judge said I was guilty of misleading and tendentious reporting. And I knew we had all the facts right, and so did Alistair, and we'd even seen the medical report from Dr. Gluckman. So we knew our story was accurate, but the press council found that we were guilty of tendentious and misleading reporting. And when you're a young journalist, that's a terrible thing for a judge to say about you, because you think that's the end of my journalistic career. And I felt so bad that I went into my newspaper and I offered them my resignation. I said, this also reflects on the newspaper. A judge has said this about me, and I offer you my resignation. And they said, are you mad? We know that you've told the truth and you're not going to resign. Those kinds of things make you tough. Because Alistair said to me, listen, don't be ridiculous. We know this is true. And if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And I said, well, I'm happy to be in the kitchen, but I'm doing the honourable thing by my newspaper. And he said, oh, no, you're not. You stand by your story. If it's the truth, you stand by it. And through millions of those experiences throughout your life, that's how you get tough. You're not born like that. You get like that through good guidance, through good experience, through learning the right lessons. And Alistair said, well, the most important thing about this is that we will prevent a cover-up. And then we did. And then I covered the inquest. And in the inquest, all those medical details were pulled out by Sidney Kentridge, who was the chief advocate there, and did a brilliant job of pulling it all out. And so, that is the story.
Now it seems so obvious, but did you go through moments of doubt when you were trying to verify whether, the story was in fact a cover-up?
Well, one thing I absolutely knew for sure was that Biko did not die of a hunger strike. Now, you don't just die in jail when you've been arrested for a week. And, they came up with all kinds of stories. People slipped on a bar of soap. People did this. Complete bloody nonsense. So we knew that he'd been murdered. The critical thing was to try and get the evidence and to find out how and why. And so we were determined to prevent a cover-up, which we then duly did. And there was an inquest, and all the terrible details came out. Although the magistrate, who was a guy called Prince, Magistrate Prince, P-R-I-N-S, he came to the conclusion that nobody could be held responsible for Steve Biko's death, which was just farcical. But by then we had everything out on the table.
And did you feel some vindication after the
Yes, I did. Yes, process? I did. Not that it, that was the point at which I had to move out of my flat because I was getting death threats and all sorts of things. I lived in Hillbrow in a flat. And I had to move out, and it was really drama, the normal drama.
What was it like taking the decision to move from journalism into politics?
Well, I never made that decision really because Alistair Sparks was fired from the Rand Daily Mail, and I was furious about that, and then I resigned myself. I tried to fight from a rearguard action as much as I could, but then I said no. And I thought the Rand Daily Mail would never be the same again because it was pandering to another target market, and so I resigned. And then I went back to university to do some economics and other stuff, which I enjoyed. And then I got very politically active again. I'd been very politically active at school and at university, but then I got very politically active again when I left journalism.
And the formal entry into politics, talk us through that from the... So you went back to UCT, as I understand it.
Yes.
And then slowly moved more into the formal political space.
Yes. I first joined the Black Sash and worked there, and the Inconscription campaign. I got married to my husband and had a child and got very involved in trying to stop forced removals in places like Nyanga and all of the crossroads, the greater crossroads area. And I got to know a lot of people there and then built quite strong networks there. and took my baby son out there, and he made lots of little friends there. It was very pleasant period. I mean, apart from the ghastly stuff that we were fighting, but on a personal level, it was enriching. That's when I got arrested and charged for being in a black area without a permit, and got myself a 6-month suspended sentence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I got myself a 6-month suspended sentence for being arrested in the area. And then I started my own little business, a public policy consultancy, and worked in that. And it's still going today. I'm not involved in it anymore, but I did start it with a colleague of mine. And then I went to UCT as the Director of Development and Communication. And then I slowly went into politics, completely by accident, into formal politics. Look, I'd always supported the Progressive Party before that, and the Progressive Federal Party after that. But I never ever thought that I would actually become involved in formal politics. In the 1980s, I was very much involved in the UDF organizations. And many of them were front organizations for the ANC in South Africa.
Yeah.
So I was very much involved there. By the end of the 80s, I was disillusioned by the ANC. And I realized that I didn't think that they could be the vehicle to bring democracy to South Africa by that stage. And I couldn't identify with the racial nationalism that I experienced there, and I couldn't identify with the Marxism. I'm a genuine non-racial liberal, and I believe that a market economy is necessary to get people into jobs. And that was the most pressing thing for South Africa. So then I moved to the DP, and I was at CODESA, which was a lovely experience as a very minor bit player in CODESA.
What are your memories of CODESA?
Very interesting. It was fascinating to see how well prepared the DP was and how we could win many, many of the arguments just by having thought things through more and being better prepared. Also, people like Pravin Gordhan played a very crucial role there. I think Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer were more figureheads.
Interesting.
But the real hard yards were done by people like Tony Leon, Dean Smuts, Colin Eglin, Ken Andrew. Yeah, it was a privilege to be there.
It's quite interesting because they're never really mentioned as central figures in that process.
Well, history is usually written by the victors. And often the stories of the real players aren't told.
We hardly ever hear about those figures in CODESA. It's all Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer and ANC.
They went fishing together. Other people were doing the heavy lifting.
Sam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below.
I read an interesting thing in your memoir where you were considering who to vote for in '94, and of course many people were saying the ANC, of course, because they brought us to this moment. And at a very early stage, you had already started thinking that they might have too much power and that might be a problem. Must have been a bit of an unpopular position at the time, but we later realized that, and many of us have come around to that perspective.
By that point, I had moved to the DP, but my husband was still a paid-up member of the ANC. And we had a debate about it. And I said, the greatest risk for South Africa's democracy going forward is that the ANC will have too much power. Too much power will be concentrated in too few hands. And I said, we have to start building a strong non-racial alternative. And he didn't agree with me. He said that he was going to vote for the ANC and that he believed that the ANC had played the leading role to bringing us into that point and that we needed to unite behind the ANC. I disagreed with that. I said, I think 10 years ahead all the time. I supported the ANC when we needed to at the time, But I said, now we need to support an alternative, and we need to support a principled alternative. So we had a debate all the way to the polling booth, and he went in and voted for the ANC, and I went in and voted for the DP.
Wow.
I was one of 1.7% of South Africans who voted for the DP.
And it's quite interesting to think back now, because we have this big debate in our country about the transition era. There are some on one side who say that it didn't change enough, and others who say it changed too much. What do you think about the Constitution? I see you have a well-worn copy on your desk.
A very well-worn copy.
And the settlement that was reached, that has laid the basis for the new society.
Look, the interim constitution was better than the final constitution. Much better. For example, it had a much more important role for the Public Service Commission in being an independent body that would play a key role in appointing officials into government, which would have prevented all of the patronage and cadre deployment that we subsequently had. There were many more checks and balances in the interim constitution than there were in the final constitution. So I think the final constitution was a step backwards. And we could have prevented a lot of the abuse of power had some of the checks and balances that were in the interim constitution still been there. But having said that, it was the best we could do in the circumstances, and it was certainly a massive improvement from apartheid, no question about that.
Sure.
So although there weren't enough checks and balances, and although the constitution was written for a President Mandela, and not for normal human beings who come in there and are fallible, it nevertheless presented a very important platform to build on, and we've been trying to protect constitutional values and support human rights ever since, and trying to make those rights meaningful in the Constitution.
If there's anything you think should change about the Constitution, what would it be, if anything?
The most important thing to change about the Constitution, in my view, is the role of politicians in selecting judges. I think that the judiciary should be strongly independent. I believe that the judiciary should be drawn from the ranks of real legal experts, and that their expertise should be the criterion and not their chromosomes or their melanin count or anything like that. And I think a good independent judiciary is indispensable for everybody's future in this country. So I would dramatically reduce the role of politicians in selecting judges. That's the most important thing I would do.
To come back to the story, and I'm aware we don't have infinite time because you're a very important person in our country these days.
No, I've got to actually go to a personal thing, a memorial service after this.
Sure. You write that it's harder to lead a political party than a government department or something to that effect.
Yeah.
Talk us through your era now as you become Cape Town mayor, and you actually are now governing as opposed to merely being in politics.
Well, I didn't think that I would be elected. I only was elected because a very fragile 7-party coalition held against all the odds. And one other person who was not supposed to vote for me did vote for me.
Wow.
Because he went against the party's instructions and did vote for me. Okay. So I got elected in a minority coalition. We didn't have 50% yet. We only would have 50% if the PAC, Mr. Bennett Joko, abstained. And so I didn't expect to be the man. Suddenly I was. And today in the DA, we do a lot of preparation with our mayoral candidates. If they get into office, they got a ready-to-govern strategy and everything's in place. I didn't know what to do. I'd never been in local government. There I was, suddenly elected the mayor.
Yeah.
And I walked into this vast empty office and I thought, what the hell do I do now? I hadn't even read all the relevant laws.
That's amazing.
Because I never thought it was possible. I mean, we'd got 27% in Cape Town in an election 2 years earlier. And now suddenly we got 42% and could put together a coalition that held. So I thought, well, this is going to last 3 weeks or 4 weeks maybe at a most before somebody changes their mind. And so I thought, well, let's be as bold as we can for the 3 weeks that we're in office. And so we were as bold as we could be for the time, and somehow it galvanized us and we went the course.
How did you actually chart a course from there?
Well, we first had to put together a government, and that wasn't easy because obviously every one of those 7 parties had fundamentally different outlooks and views on the world. They all wanted their little kingdom in their little portfolio. They all wanted to be hermetically sealed from any influence of the DA, and then crucially importantly at the time, and in every subsequent coalition, all the smaller parties gang up together against the bigger party to cut the bigger party down to size. So it was very hard, and there was a guy called Buddy Shaban, you won't remember it, you're too young, but Buddy Shaban was representing the African Muslim Party at the time, and he was a bit of a renegade even in that party, and he wanted to get control of all the property owned by the city of Cape Town to manage it to his financial interest, and he was very open about that. So he was a bit of a mafioso in government, and eventually I had to fire him. And because I fired him from the MACO, his party, had decided to leave, and then our government fell. But at that point, Patricia de Lille, who had sided up till then with the ANC, came across to us and came and saved our government.
And it was just 3 years, is that right?
I was mayor of Cape Town from 2006 to 2009, yes.
I couldn't believe that because one thinks of it as a much longer period.
It was a very short period I was mayor for, and then I became the premier.
Yeah, in 2009.
Yes.
And what was different about being premier to being mayor?
Well, the most obvious thing being premier was that I had an overall majority. We got 51% in that election in the province. Now that was spectacular because we didn't have to manage these very complex coalitions, and we could get on governing according to a DA mandate. So it was a lot easier being premier than mayor.
I bet. And coalitions have been with us for a long time. Actually.
And they will be with us forever because we're a proportional representation system.
Yeah.
And so when you're in a proportional representation system, coalitions are almost inevitable. There are very few proportional systems that don't have coalitions.
And local government coalitions have actually been quite common long before whatever's happened at the national level.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the biggest challenge is that we don't have any thresholds in our coalitions. Now, let me tell you what that means. In any country that has a proportional system and therefore has coalitions, they have what is known as a threshold. So in Germany, it's a high threshold. It is 5%. And if any party can't get up to 5%, then they don't get any seats in the coalition at all, or in government at all, or in that sphere of government at all. So if you, let's say, are the FDP, which is our sister party in Germany, and you get 4.5% of the vote, you don't get any representation at all in that sphere of government because you haven't met the threshold of 5%. And that is to ensure that the tail doesn't wag the dog. You've got to show that you are a serious party before you can exercise power in that government. Now, in Denmark, it's a much lower threshold. It's 2%. And in many other European countries, it's around 2%. We have none. So that means you can get a Kabelo Gwamanda, for example, as mayor of Johannesburg, where he got, let's say, 2,000 votes across the whole of Johannesburg. And suddenly he's made the mayor because the tail wags the dog, because we don't have thresholds. So the DA has long been a proponent of having thresholds, which would take away a lot of the tiny little parties that swap from one side to the other and decide with, let's say, 2,000 votes in an entire metro of 6 million people, whether or not to put the ANC in power or the DA in power. Now, that's a completely distorted, undemocratic system. And that's why you've got to have a threshold. And that's why we've always supported having thresholds.
So you governed the Western Cape for 2 terms, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And then it seemed that you
I retired.
Stepping away
I
from
retired.
politics.
I thought, that's great now.
Yeah.
And I had my first grandchild in 2017. So that was a big watershed in my life, my absolute joy. And I thought, great, I'm now going to be a granny. I had so much time taken away from being a mom. And as I said, I was delighted that my children have turned out into functional adults, because if they hadn't, I would have really, really blamed myself 100%.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've now got grandchildren, and I'm going to really make up for what I didn't do as a mother with my grandchildren. So I was very keen on that. And then I was approached to stand for the chair of Federal Council.
Yeah, yeah.
And the party was saying, we've lost our ideological moorings. We've swallowed critical race theory, hook, line, and sinker. We are making identity politics the dominant determinant of decisions in the party, rather than the principles that we've always stood for. And something's got to fix it, because we're going to unravel. And in the 2019 election, the unraveling did start. We started unraveling across all voter sectors. And then they came to me and said, would I please stand again for chair of Federal Council? So I went home to discuss it with my husband, and he said, are you mad? You've just retired, we're having a good time, we're planning to go overseas and do this and that for a holiday first, and no. So I thought I'd better listen to him. Next morning he wakes up, he says, no, I can see that you want to do this. And I can see that you'll never give yourself any peace, or me any peace, if you don't do it, because you feel that you want to try and get the DA on course again. So he said, if you want to do it, I'll support you. So I thought, maybe I'll put my hat in the ring. I'd just been elected the branch chairperson of the branch that I was then living in. And someone, came and brought me the papers to be nominated, and then I agreed to be nominated.
Yeah.
I didn't know that I would win, because the party was very divided around the new direction it was going to at that time, and some people supported it and some people didn't.
Yeah.
But I did get in, I did win, and then I came back and have been at it full time. Yeah.
You brought Musi, or I don't know if you alone brought Musi into politics, but you were quite central to Musi Maimane's rise. And of course, at that time, when you came back, it was when he was leaving the party. What was that like for
Well, I think he left the party for several reasons, one of which was the Commission of Inquiry that he established as to why we'd gone backwards in the election, found that it was a consequence of his weak leadership. So that was one of the reasons. And I also think that he was worried about having me as chair of the Federal Council, which was actually ironic because, obviously he charted his own course in politics, but if anybody did as much as they could to help him, it was me. And I really felt he'd be the ideal leader of the party. I felt he really knew what non-racialism was about, because his family is a model of non-racialism, number one. So I really thought he understood non-racialism. He had a degree in theology, so I thought, well, he must be an ethical and really decent person. And then he had a degree in business administration. So I thought, well, it covers all the bases. You don't get better than that. That ticks a lot of boxes. He's a very good orator. Yes. And then for some reason, with this tidal wave through social media of identity politics from the States, and all of the guys like Ta-Nehisi Coates and all of the other guys, it just started yeast cooking through the DA in a way that really, really undid our ideological underpinnings.
Talk us through that, because on this platform, what we're trying to do is give different perspectives to people without necessarily trying to be confrontational about it.
Yeah.
And it did seem to me that you had also undergone quite an interesting shift, to the extent that on the one hand, the DA was thinking about being a little less opposed to BEE and those kinds of policies. And then you clearly realized that there was something wrong with this approach. What do you see as, and I'm trying to ask you to steal, I'm trying to steel man your position here as well. What is the problem with taking identity seriously, and why do you think, even though it may look on the surface like the obvious thing to do, it's actually a counterproductive move?
Well, the most important thing about you is what you decide the most important thing about you is. It is completely unacceptable for everybody else to define the most important thing about you as being your color and your chromosomes.
Sure.
So that's the first thing from a liberal perspective. You get to decide who you are and what the most important attributes are of your identity. And it is incredibly dangerous in a society when the society decides that the most important thing about people is their color, and the most important thing about people is their chromosomes, and that they will be put into a box and labeled and their value determined by those identity markers. That is the dangerous thing. And so you suddenly get a hierarchy of victimhood based on race and based on gender and based on sexuality. That becomes fixed as categories determined not by individuals but by a broader movement in society that decides those are the main categories of identity. And then people's value and evil and good are judged on the basis of how they are labeled in that hierarchy. Sure. Now that is extremely dangerous. That is what apartheid did. If you get back to the root of apartheid, that is what it is. Identity politics in the American sense is apartheid, but reversed. It is saying that 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. If you're a black person, if you're gay, if you are non-binary, if you are a woman, you've got virtue points. If you're a white male heterosexual, you've got villain points. And the world, as we know it, and all its institutions have been built by the villains who dominate them in order to continue controlling all of the victims. That is the argument. Now, I don't buy that argument, and I reject the notion that people define me by the fact that I've got 2 X chromosomes. I want them to define me by whether I'm a decent human being, whether I stick to my word, whether I have an ethical foundation, whether I'm decent to other people. That's how I want people to judge me. I'm not interested in the fact that I'm white. And you know, people can say to me, well, you've never suffered and your family's never been oppressed. I have to smile at that because I know that the story is entirely different. We do know what oppression is. And so to make generalized judgments about people on identity markers as the basis for a social order is fundamentally wrong. Let's get back then to BEE.
Sure.
If BEE worked to uplift the poor, I'd be right there, but it doesn't. It doesn't do that at all. What it does do is give the wealthy and politically powerful a fig leaf to cover up their looting of the state, which just makes poor people poorer and poorer and poorer. Like Jacob Zuma said to me, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just doing BEE when he defined state capture. And I said, absolutely, I know you are doing BEE. That's why we oppose it, because it's got nothing to do with empowering poor people. So we are about empowering people who are disadvantaged by the past, not by giving a fig leaf to wealthy, politically powerful people to continue milking the system. That is the issue.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it.
What do you make of Zuma's decision to start MK Party? You obviously must have some relationship with him, yeah.
Look, personally, I like Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma has always been unbelievably kind and nice to me.
Interesting.
And that's just the bottom line. I'm never going to say otherwise because it wouldn't be true.
Sure.
In fact, he was nicer to me than almost everybody in my own party was.
Wow.
Yeah, he was. He was so kind to me. I mean, before I went to my very first big overall cabinet, Lekgotla, where I was the only DA person there in 2009, he phoned me up the night before. Now, you must remember I had just run an entire campaign saying, "Stop Zuma." Entire campaign. Phoned me up the night before. He says, "Hello, Premier." I said, "Hello, President." He says, "You're coming up for your first Lekgotla tomorrow." I said, "Yes." He said to me, "You will be the only DA person there, and all the rest of us will be ANC. But I want you to know you'll be very warmly welcomed."
Wow.
I thought, my goodness, this is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And when I went there, I was warmly welcomed. And he always let me have my say. And he always let me speak against what the ANC was doing and what he was doing. So, and when my party was trying to kick me out and do all of those things, who phoned me and contacted me and said, "This is wrong"? Jacob Zuma. So you see, he's a very kind person at heart. But he's corrupt. And the two things can work together in an amazing way.
Sure. And what do you make of MK Party's bursting onto the scene?
Well, I heard about it before, actually, because last August, I got tipped off that he was going to start a party.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that was a time when my political analysis failed me, because I thought, this party can't get anywhere. I mean, here's a person who's been so seriously implicated by the Zondo Commission, in state capture, been thrown out of the ANC effectively, this and that. There's no way that a party led by him is going to have any traction.
Yeah.
I've never been more wrong.
Yeah, well, many people were surprised, I suppose.
Shows you the power of identity politics as people choose it themselves. I mean, that was a very powerful Zulu vote, because they were saying, in my sense, don't mess with the most senior Zulu person in politics today, because we all take it as an insult. Now, that is people applying identity politics, but through their own volition, through the vote.
You say you're someone who thinks 10 years ahead. What do you see in 10 years? What are you thinking about South African politics in 10 years from now?
Well, the ANC will be coming apart more and more as we go forward. There are two poles of politics that are important. One is the pole represented by Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema now.
Yeah.
It used to just be by Julius Malema, but now it's... And that's the pole that has the vision of the leader controlling the party controlling the state controlling society. It's the model that has led to most state failure on the planet. On the other side is the DA's model. The DA's model is the open society, defending rights and freedoms, the non-racial society running under constitutionalism and the rule of law, with a market-based economy that can create jobs. And that is the model for every successful, prosperous country and inclusive country that exists today. So these two models are against each other. The one is democratic centralism, which has got nothing to do with democracy, but is centralism. And others is the open opportunity society that we stand for. The ANC does not know where it stands. So while the one pole was only occupied by EFF and Julius Malema at one point, the big break-off of Jacob Zuma and going towards that pole, and in fact taking over that pole, is a sign of the ANC coming apart between these two alternative visions for the future of South Africa. And the big fight now between Paul Mashatile and Cyril Ramaphosa in the middle of the presidency around many issues in the GNU shows how those two poles are pulling in opposite directions.
Interesting.
And the big question for 10 years hence is, who will be the biggest bloc? Will it be the non-racial constitutionalists who believe in growth and jobs and inclusion? Or will it be the National Democratic Revolution crowd having a supreme leader controlling the party, and the party controlling the state, and the state controlling the economy and society, which is a doomsday message for South Africa? It will result in complete collapse. And those are the two choices. And the big question over the next 10 years is, which one will build the new majority?
And in closing, what do you think are the most important milestones on the political calendar in the next few years?
The most important thing is that the Government of National Unity should hold. But by far the most important milestone is going to be who succeeds Cyril Ramaphosa. That is going to be defining for South Africa's future.
Yeah, yeah.
and whether we become a failed state or a successful democracy.
Wow, you think it's as serious as that?
It's as serious as that, because it depends on how, as the ANC breaks up, which faction controls the breakup. So it is very, very important. There's no question about that. I think there are a range of critically important moments. The 2026 election is going to be a pivotal moment, because I think there's a real chance that the DA could become the biggest party in almost all the metros.
Yeah.
And that'll be
can see
very, very good for South Africa. It'll be a big watershed. And then we move on to the 2029 election, when the realignment of politics that is well underway and pushed very hard in 2024, in 2029 will come full circle, I think.
When will the DA Congress be? Do we know yet? Probably 26?
The DA Congress has to be every 3 years,
Yeah.
so it'll be in 2026, yes.
That should be fun to watch.
Yes.
Well, Helen Zille, thank you so much for joining us again. It's great to have you, and it's been interesting to learn more about you and bust some myths. And we're really honored that you would join us on SMWX.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it was a very pleasant chat. Thank you, Sizwe.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. Help us get to 200,000 subscribers. Like, share, and comment below, and keep it locked on SMWX. Aye, yeah, yeah.
Aye, yeah, yeah.